Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm really excited to be here with all of you guys. Um, I did this last year, and I had a really good response. I had a really good time. And last year, I predicted that we'd be in a recession by now. And, it's true that the official numbers do not confirm that we're in a recession. However, I'm rather skeptical of the official numbers. I believe that we really have been in a recession for quite some time. And if it wasn't an election year, I think that the news media would absolutely be calling it a recession. And if you follow Mises.org's articles, Ryan has been publishing some excellent stuff on things like look at the job numbers and how they've just been lying to us. We see every month and every quarter you have these revisions to the numbers, and they're always much, much worse than the initial. So, um, anyway, I suspect that for any it was any other time we would have been declared to be in a recession, but because of reasons we're not. However, for today's presentation, I'd like to cover some fundamentals. And it's always good to cover the fundamentals because when we're talking to most people are not very deep in economics. They don't understand economics, they don't understand economic policy. And so just covering, the fundamentals, the big differences between the Austrian school and the mainstream is I think really important when we are discussing this with our friends or um, other people online and such. So let's take a look. So if we look at the School of Economics, there's a lot of different things. There's a lot of different schools. And so it's sort of like a religion, right? In religion, you have Christianity, but you've got your Catholics, your Methodists, your Presbyterians, and all of these, your Baptists, right, and all these other different denominations. Well, in economics, we don't have denominations. What we have are schools of thought. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of them. Now, Mises Wire published Mark Thornton's essay back in 2014, and he had this little chart here, which I think is really nice. Um, so I don't want to cover all of these different things, but I just want to focus on the Austrians, aka the good guys, and compare and contrast that with the neoclassicals. Okay, so I'm not going to read what Mark Thornton here has, but later on you can take a look at his article. It's really very good. So let's first of all take a look at the purpose. Why do mainstream economists do what mainstream economists do? And the answer is it's all about prediction. Okay. How can we forecast? How can we look into the future? And it's really the assumptions that are important are not important as how well the model predicts. Um, Now, before I get too deep into this, let me just pause here. Uh, are these slides in motion? Can you see my cool little AI cartoons of Milton Friedman and the looking glass or the glass ball?
We have a few people in the chat here that are having issues with it, but most people can see everything. So
Most
I think
people
it's
can
just
see
a
it. Okay,
software issue here.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so I ran this through AI, and I had Milton Friedman forecasting into a crystal ball, and it came up with these pictures. I thought they were pretty fantastic. But here's the point. It's not about how well we explain the world. It's about how well does our model predict the future. And so we'll make some really crazy assumptions, but if it predicts better than anything else, then that's what we're going to use. Now, in contrast to that, we have the Austrians. And the Austrians, it's about how to understand the world. How does the world work? Right? How does it get put together? And an accurate prediction is impossible because what we see is that the world is kind of like this flock of birds here, right? It's ever changing. It's all coordinated, but it's never quite the same. And so it's not about trying to make an accurate prediction. It's not about trying to forecast what the future's like. And there's a whole lot of problems with that. But it's about, why does the world fit together in the way that it does? So, where do we start? Well, if you're the mainstream, we start by looking at data, lots and lots of data. Now, data is, of course, historical, it's all in the past. But this is what we use, and we plug it into our econometric models. And so we use these fancy mathematical equations to approximate what we think reality looks like. Again, in contrast to that, we look at the Austrians. And for the Austrians, the starting point is twofold. First, we start with the axiom of human action. And we just passed the 75th anniversary of Mises's human action. It's quite an amazing thing. And secondly, we live in a world of scarcity, right? If there was no such thing as scarcity, there would be no need for economics. Because we live in this world where I want the same thing that you want, or there's just not enough to go around, the question is, well, how do we decide? Who gets what? Who should do what? How do we produce, right? All of these questions stem from scarcity. Now, how do we then, once we have this fundamental starting point, what's next? Well, for the mainstream, we begin with representative agents. We just have clones of one another, right? Or maybe these sorts of clones, right? Our clone troopers. And then what we do is we take a look at totals and aggregates. So in the last talk, there was a lot of debate about the equation of exchange. Money times velocity equals the price level times real GDP. Is that a legitimate equation? Well, if you take money times velocity, what do you get? You get nominal GDP. If you take the price level times real GDP, what do you get? Nominal GDP. And what you get is nominal GDP equals nominal GDP. It's a tautology, right? And does it reflect the real world? Does it help us to better understand how things go on? It doesn't matter. It's how well does this predict? Does it show us a better way of predicting the future, right? So what the Austrians are doing when we're looking at our approach is we're rejecting these sorts of highly aggregated totals. We recognize that each person is not the same. So how then do we approach it? We approach it through methodological individualism. And that's a great phrase. It's really long, and you can go home and tell mom, like, hey, look what I learned today. Right? But it's actually fairly simple. Anytime we see ological or ology, like biology, right, it just means the science of. And so methodological just means, what's our scientific method? How are we approaching things? And the answer is, we're approaching it through the individual. We want individual people to be the basis, right? That's the smallest unit. And this goes all the way back to the founder of Austrian economics, Karl Menger, where he talks about what is the origin, what is the genesis, right? And so if I look at General Motors, right? General Motors is a car company. And I can say General Motors is coming out with a new car this fall. And that's what? That's a shorthand expression that I can use to talk about a group of individuals. But there is no General Motors. General Motors is not an individual, it's not an entity, doesn't have a brain, doesn't have a heart, doesn't have a soul. In fact, General Motors, not even a real general. Yeah, who knew? So General Motors then is a shorthand expression. So I should be saying what? That a group of people have sat down and designed a car. Another group of people have turned that design into a plan to put it together. And then another group of people have designed the parts to make, and then the tools to make the parts. And then another group of people will make those tools. Another group will assemble those parts, and then on and on and on until there's a car. So when we say GM is coming out with a car next fall, what we're really saying is that all of these people are cooperatively behaving in such a way that yields this result. But I don't want to take half an hour just to get to, hey, did you see the new car that's coming out this fall? So what we do is we use these collective terms. And unfortunately, sometimes these collective terms turn us down the wrong path. And that's why we always have to come back to check our foundation, right? Methodological individualism. Now, a key aspect of methodological individualism are incentives. Now, if we're looking at an economic problem and we're just talking to one of our friends and they don't really know anything or much about economics, one of the key things that we need to instill in them is the notion of incentives. How do individuals react to incentives? Not how do institutions react, but how do individuals in those institutions? How does not the company react, but how does the CEO of the company react? And those might not be aligned. And then as you progress into economics, we'll see that sometimes this manifests as principal agent problems. So we always want to keep coming back to the individual and checking ourselves, right? Now, the other side that Austrians do in method is logical deduction, okay? And it's just like mathematics, where we start off with 1 plus 1 equals 2. And from that, we can deduce calculus. Well, with Austrians, we begin with the human action axiom. We take that axiom, which is true, always true, cannot be falsified throughout time or space. Anywhere you find a human, there is a human action axiom. And what is that? It says, when confronted with scarcity, people will act purposefully. And so there's a subsidiary assumption that we live in a world of scarcity. And so when I go to the store, I don't just randomly grab things off the shelf. What do? I choose. I purposely choose. And I could ask a person, hey, why did you buy what you bought? But in fact, I don't even have to do that. I can just look inside myself and I can ask myself, Paul, self, why did I do that? Right? Why did I make that decision? Right? I would say, well, I believe the benefits outweigh the costs. And from that starting point, we can build the entire corpus of economics. Now, how do we go about building the economic science? So, for the mainstream, they begin with perfect knowledge. And when they say perfect knowledge, and I like this picture here because it's Hayek. It's kind of a counterpoint here, but it's like surveying the entire board all at once. It's outside of time. I'm looking at all of the different possibilities that all the different pieces could possibly move. And for the mainstream, it's comparative statics. I start in the first intersection where demand crosses supply that produces price 1, Q1, and then bam, there's a change, and then we shift to D2, and now we have a new price, and we have a new quantity. Once in a while, you'll have a professor very early on say, well, it is a process where with an increase in demand, what you have is a temporary shortage and it coordinates. But once you get past that, you rarely ever hear of the coordination process unless you have an Austrian professor. And so the Austrians, in contrast, engage in a step-by-step process. And so when we were looking at the problem of, say, an increase in money supply, just like Jonathan was talking about, right? So what happens? Well, it's not this all at once. It's not this jump. It's not a comparative static where it's here's the initial position that we're in, and then stuff happens, and then I'm going to compare it to the end result. It doesn't work that way. Instead, what we see is that first one person or one group of people get new money. And then what do they do with that? Well, some of them are going to spend it. Some of them are going to save it. Some of it are going to invest it. Well, on what items are they going to spend it? That activity then pushes up those prices. That affects this next group of people. and then so on. It is a step-by-step analysis. And by using the step-by-step analysis, we're talking about a process. In addition to that, we see that with the Austrians, we don't assume that we can see the entire chessboard all at once. There is incomplete and there is dispersed knowledge. What is the correct price of shoes? What is the correct price of kiwi? If if you were a business manager, right, it would be great to wake up one morning and go, oh yeah, I think I'll just set price to equal to equilibrium price. Well, what is it? We have no idea. It's only through competition and through the market that we move and discover what these equilibrium prices are. In addition to this, the step-by-step analysis and this admission that the actors have incomplete and dispersed knowledge, that we lead to the next big tool that we use is counterfactual reasoning. If that person, A, gets the new money first, what do they spend it on? Well, they'd spend it on a jet ski. But what if that person A doesn't get the money? What if person B gets the money first? Well, what is B going to spend it on? Person B spends it on jewelry. And so it matters who gets the money first. Which prices are going to be impacted is affected by that initial distribution, by that initial change. And that's called counterfactual reasoning. If A didn't get the money, then what happens, right? And we do this for everything. If you have an economic policy, what if we have a minimum wage? Versus what if we don't have a minimum wage? Or what if we have a minimum wage at $15 an hour versus a minimum wage of $20 an hour, right? And we use counterfactual reasoning all the time, right? I certainly do. What do I want for lunch? Well, I could have this or I could have that, right? That's counterfactual reasoning. So taking incentives and counterfactual reasoning and marrying those two things together and using that with the people that you discuss economic problems with, you're going to be able to cover 90% of what most people care about and do so effectively. So once we have this approach where we have our initial purpose and our starting point and our method and our process, now we need to ask ourselves, why does this matter? Right? What are the implications and what are the applications? Well, as I was hinting, let's take a look at money. So the Austrians begins by saying that money doesn't just exist, it has to begin somewhere. And it wasn't invented like the telephone was invented. Money has to evolve from the market. But the mainstream, they say, well, it exists, it's a given. Who cares where it comes from? Because they don't want to understand. What they're trying to do is predict, right? It's a very different mindset. For the Austrians, we take the same rules of economics and we apply it to money. And so I think the most effective way of looking and studying money is using the supply of money and the demand for money, right? Just the same rules. Don't go aggregating it into MV or anything like that. Just stay microeconomic, right? Um, but for the mainstream, it is MV equals PQ. One of the big differences then are these non-neutral effects. In other words, this is what Jonathan was just talking about when he was saying the Cantillon effects. So when money is injected into the economy, the people who get the money first are able to spend at today's prices. They have a positive win. But as that money slowly spreads through the economy, and Hayek once said it's sort of like honey. You pour it onto a plate and watch how slowly it moves across the plate. Well, there are some people who haven't received the new money yet, but their prices have gone up. In fact, their real wealth has gone down. And so there's a real wealth transfer from the people who get the new money last to the people who get the new money first. In contrast, the mainstream, they say that money is neutral. In fact, we don't really care, right? A magical helicopter comes in, I'm just going to increase the money supply by 2%. How does that affect the price level? And we're off to the races. So for the Austrians, when we look at monetary injections, we always have to know that there's going to be some winners and there's definitely going to be many losers. But in the mainstream, increasing the money supply only affects the price level. Okay, next topic, markets. So for the Austrians, the market is a process, right? It's never in equilibrium jumping to the next point. But for the mainstream, we're looking at equilibrium. That is our starting point, right? If we are looking at the Austrians, and I put yesterday's price and quantity, and that was all the information I had, or last week's, or I had a whole stream of price and quantity that my business sold. Let me ask you, is that an equilibrium? I have no idea, right? It's just a point. It's just data. Is it near the demand curve? Is it on the demand curve? Is it close to the supply curve? But for the mainstream, they're doing what? They're just drawing their curves, finding the intersection, and all of their equations have equal signs. Meaning what? They're starting in equilibrium. The Austrians never assume that we're in equilibrium. In fact, what's the likelihood we're in equilibrium? It's practically zero. And even if we were in equilibrium, one person changes a taste or a preference, changes their mind, and it throws the whole thing off again. For the mainstream, they say that markets are thus automatic, right? That it's not a process. For the Austrians, entrepreneurs are critical to coordinate buyers and sellers. How do you buy a house? How do you sell a house? I need an agent. I need someone to connect these two things together. In the mainstream, entrepreneurs and money aren't even really important in microeconomic models. In fact, they don't model them at all. So when we look at the Austrians, we see that buyers and sellers cooperate. But for markets, competition is a state. It is not an action verb, right? What do they have? They have a perfectly, you have a market where you have perfect competition. What's the state? It's competition, noun, right? Perfect competition, adjective, noun. It's sad. In fact, if you just look at sports, why do they play the game? It's because on any particular day, any one team can beat any other team. That's why we play the game. That's competition, that rivalrous process. Welfare analysis. So, for the Austrians, interventionism distorts relative prices. These distortions create false information. This false information then disrupts efficiency. Interventionism makes total welfare worse. And when I say welfare, I mean happiness or well being of a society. Now, total welfare is made worse, although some small groups may benefit at the expense of everyone else. Now, markets do not always generate the best results according to the mainstream. And so, what do they turn to? They turn to government. And they say that government intervention by experts, mainly themselves, is necessary to correct market imperfections and market failures. And we assume that government officials are saintly and omniscient. They know everything. Economic calculation. For the Austrians, to allocate capital and intermediate goods efficiently, we need to know relative scarcity conditions. Now, what do we call relative scarcity conditions? Basically, we need to know the price. The source of this knowledge is the market. And only when there is private property can the market generate relative prices, also known as relative scarcity conditions, which contain that knowledge. However, for the mainstream, once all the variables have been specified, then the correct solution is simply a matter of crunching numbers, plugging it into a high-powered calculator, and we have an answer. As supercomputers become better, scientific planning will improve. Now, just as a point of reference, a friend of mine, Lucas Engelhart, and I published a year ago, basically at this time last year, an article showing how supercomputers could not do this, even if we assumed away the incentives argument, Hayek's knowledge argument, and Mises's calculation argument, and we came up with a fourth one called the computation argument. Um, anyway, that's in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics this time last year. And so finally, what's the conclusion of the mainstream? Property rights are irrelevant and unnecessary. The final implication is when we talk about the macroeconomy or business cycle theory. So for the Austrians, business cycles have a definite cause, an expansion of the money supply. As the money supply expands, interest rates are falsely lowered. These create false signals, and this artificial signals create an artificial boom. And this boom then leads to an upper turning point and a bust, which we call a recession. The recession is a painful but necessary phase. For the mainstream, there is no such thing as a business cycle. All there are economic shocks. There are exogenous to the model. If they were endogenous, they would know exactly how to deal with it. But they're a surprise. These shocks are either positive or negative. They come from outside the economic model and are therefore unpredictable. The best we can do is manage the economy to meet these challenges. So after the 2007 through 2009 recession, a Fed economist from Charlotte came to my university, University of Mount Olive, and he said, you know, the economy is like a guy on a bicycle. And a car came by and clipped him and knocked him into the ditch. Oh, that's bad. So what we need to do, our job as the Fed, is to get the guy back onto the road and pedaling again. That was his theory. That was his business cycle theory, right? So where does the car come from? Is the car coming back? Are there more cars? Right? They're just exogenous shocks. That's all. And the exogenous shock will take us off the trend either up and then we return to trend, or they bump us into the ditch and then we return to trend. That's their theory. That's not a theory. That's terrible. So, to help alleviate this, I wrote this little book, Austrian Business Cycle Theory, an Introduction, and please get a whole bunch of copies of this. I don't make a dime from it. I'm not selling it because I'm making tons of money. I don't get anything from it. But I was very frustrated with the lack of one source where I could use it to teach my students. And so if you want a nice introduction that you can hand to someone, it's 72 pages long, and that includes all of the extra stuff too. So it's a nice short little thing. In addition to that, if you go on Mises, I put up the PowerPoint presentation for it, and it's got all of the graphs. All of the graphs move. If you find a typo in it, let me know. And this is how you can contact me, pcwik@umo.edu. I guess we can plug that into the chat box as well. But thank you very, very much. And I am now ready to take questions. Am I back?
Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and kick off the questions here. Just recently, the inversion of the 10-year treasury and the 3-year treasury went from being an inverted status to an uninverted status. So do you think that this is potentially significant for a coming recession? Do you think maybe this is a sign that we're already in a recession? Or do you think that maybe the inversion is maybe not such a great tool to use to try to predict where we are in a business cycle anymore?
That's a fantastic question. And let me see if I can share my screen again. Can I do, yeah, okay, let's do here. Entire screen, that one. And okay, do you guys see this graph?
Still loading for me. I think a couple
All right,
people here can see it, so you can go ahead and proceed.
Okay. Um, so I'll try it one more time. I'm flexible that way.
The screen share on
Bear with
Discord
me.
here is still a little funky sometimes, so
Not a problem. Okay. So this is um, my Excel spreadsheet that I've been keeping since April of 1953. And if you guys can you see it now, hopefully?
we're gonna have someone take a screenshot of it here and put it in the chat for everyone who can't see it.
Okay, well, I've got three of them, so go ahead and do the screenshot. And what we see is that it inverts and then there's a recession. It inverts and then there's a recession. It inverts and then there's a recession, right? It's as it's coming out of the recession, right? So let me move to the next one, right? This one shows it a bit more clearly. Um, as we come out of the inversion, that's when we start to slide into the recession. So after it inverts, it's about 4 to 6 quarters after we see the inversion that that we have a recession. So this is all up to date through December. Okay, all of this data right here. Um, okay, so anyway, um, okay, I see one up in the chat. I guess you guys missed the other two, but that's okay. So it's 4 to 6 quarters after it inverts, we see the recession, and so we are now in the beginning of quarter 7. So it's a little bit late, but honestly, when we look at all the monkeying that the Fed has done on the long end of the yield curve, um, it's I think it's just a good predictor tool. Um, but it's just a tool. Don't say it has to work this way, right? Does that make sense? Do we just follow that?
That makes sense. So just an add-on question to that: if you do think that a recession is still kind of in the works here, or just because it's just been delayed a little bit by the Fed, um, do you have some sort of prediction on where you think that might officially begin, or anything like that?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. Um, okay, so first of all, it's the way the Fed has been expanding the money supply is not the traditional stuff that we see in in this little guy right here, because you can see how thin it is, right? It's just basically saying there's one interest rate. There was an article by Tom Mullen on Mises Wire in December 22nd, and it's actually a really good article. It's called "Is the Fed Loosening or Tightening? It's Complicated." And what's going on is the Fed has decoupled the price of the Fed funds market with reserves. And by doing this, it has created a mess. And so basically what you have is the interest rate on reserve balances, which is what the Fed pays to banks, as the upper bound, and the uh, award rate of the reverse repo market as the lower bound, and they separate each other by about 10 basis points. And the Fed funds is allowed to fluctuate within that 10 basis points. Now, that means they have complete control on the price of the Fed funds rate. But because they have opened up the Fed funds market beyond just banks, so you have other institutions like money market mutual funds and Fannie and Freddie that are able to tap into this market now. You have the reserves unhinged to that price. And so where that money is now being pushed into is not your normal channels. And so basically, this is a really long answer to say no one has a clue where this bubble is if it's locating in one spot. If anything, it's a more general bubble that's just sort of economy wide.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Let me pull up another question we have here in the chat. All right. So related to the recession question, we have a question here from Slayer of Utility Functions, and she asks, "Do you think the official people will declare a recession on January 20th?"
No, that would be way too transparent, right? Um, no, but they will look. They're not dumb people, right? Um, but they're pretty clever. So what they'll do is they'll bide their time just a little bit, and as soon as they can show a trigger or an event, right, then they'll jump all over and say, "Ah, we're in a recession," right? And it's all because of all of these free market policies or the rollback of regulations, or we didn't spend enough money, or some reason. Um, but they'll blame it on free market economics.
Another question here from Dachik, and he asked, "What are the core distinctions between the dynamic element of DSGE models and the dynamic efficiency of entrepreneurs in the free market?" And then he adds, "Do you think this is a good perspective to contrast the neoclassical and Austrian perspectives?"
What was the first part of the question?
The first part is, what are the core distinctions between the dynamic elements of
Core
DSGE
distinctions.
models?
Okay.
Yeah. And then the dynamic elements
So
of
so
entrepreneurs in the market.
right. Okay. So the core distinction of the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model is this, and I do actually talk about this in my little book right at the very beginning, where it says what the DSGE model is saying is we've found this pattern of data, and then this exogenous shock comes in and hits that trend, hits that pond, right, and it creates ripples. Now, where did the rock that just came into the pond come from, right? We don't know. Is there another rock? Is the rock going to return, right? How many more rocks are there? And the answer is, well, all of these things are exogenous. They're all just outside of the model, and because they're exogenous and outside, we can't predict them. We don't have any theory. We're not trying to understand it, right? And so, to me, it's just a mess of. I think it's people really just trying to be super smart about themselves, and and because they're not really trying to understand how the economy fits together. Now, when we look at the Austrian point of view, right, not only are we trying to understand how the economy works together, but we have these microeconomic building blocks, and we are able to check if we've made an error because we're using that deduction, right, our logical deduction. And so by using this method of logical deduction, starting with methodological individualism and human action axiom, and the idea of scarcity, we can build out how we expect things to work. Because if we have data, is that confirming what our hypothesis is, or is it not? How do we even do that? Because honestly, when we're looking at the scientific method, we have to be able to control all these other variables other than what we're just focusing in on. And we can't. It's impossible to do because we're dealing with human beings through time. And as a result, there is no such thing as a controlled experiment. And because there's no such thing as a controlled experiment, I can't confirm or deny. And so, what they have on the mainstream side is they begin with a tautology. They then use data of the past. They assume that the past data is predicting the future. They then have these things that are exogenous, which they can't account for because that's what exogenous means. And they're just like, well, that's what happens. And so now we have to do our socialism to fix this. Give us more power, please, and more wealth and more prestige. Versus the Austrians, who are starting from a core, a base of absolute knowledge, and building from it that we can check internally and then use that to help understand what's going on in the real world. And so that's how I would contrast the DSGE model versus the Austrian business cycle model of entrepreneurs and market participants. Did I I cover that question, or or is there still a part out there that I need to hit?
I think you covered everything there.
Okay.
We have one last question here. It's another one about yield curves and things like that. We've been talking about that a little bit in the server here, so that's why we have some questions on that one. He asked,
Okay.
is there some reason there might be a relation between yield curve uninversion and the onset of a recession? It seems a little counterintuitive because if the short end is falling due to Fed cuts, then that should prolong the boom. Is there any other reasoning, possibly due to long rates rising, that could explain the onset of the recession? And I can repeat any part of that if you need me to.
Okay. So um, what we're looking at, the thing that causes the recession is the misalignment of the capital structure. Okay. If all it were was prices and interest rates are prices, then the neoclassicals, the mainstream would be right. And we would not have this problem. But because what happens, this is the step-by-step analysis, right? And I do go through a little bit of this in my dissertation. So if you want to find that on Mises.org, it's 200 and some pages, puts you right to sleep. But what we see happening is at the initial phase of the recession is that actually at the upper turning point is that the short-term rates spike. The long rates don't move that much. That's what causes the inversion, and it's a scramble for capital because the different companies need to complete their projects in order to basically cover their initial investments. Now, what happens though is that we have built the wrong capital structure. So um, imagine we have a business where we are making tables and a table made out of wood, right? And so I've built up a whole bunch of business cutting down trees, logging trees, and such. I have a whole bunch of factories that can turn boards into tables, but what I don't have are the sawmills that can turn the trees into the boards. No amount of price adjustment can fix that problem. There's a bottleneck, right? And so I have so many lumberjacks. I have so many, retail stores ready to sell tables. I have so many, wholesalers ready to go. I just don't have the sawmills. And because I don't have that step in the capital structure, the whole thing crunches and collapses. Sorry. And so no amount of price changes, including the interest rate, will fix that problem. And so, excuse me. So what we see happening is that when the interest rates are trying to readjust because the Fed is scrambling, right? It's too late. It's much too late. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. All right. Well, we don't want to keep you too long here. So, just in closing here, where can people find you at? And do you have anything that you want to plug?
Okay, so this came out just recently, and this is my Austrian business cycle theory and introduction. You can see it's very, very thin. You can get it on Mises.org for $8. I don't make a dime from it, so I'm not trying to make myself rich or anything. You can also get it for free in PDF form at Mises.org or an EPUB version. There's also a PowerPoint that goes along with it where it moves all the curves and everything. You can find me on X, but I've been permanently banned since October, and I don't know why. Who knows? So the email that I presented at the end of my presentation, and what I'll put right now at umo.edu, that's the best way to reach me. So just if you email me, just tell me where we met, and just say I was on this Discord thing, blah blah blah, and I have this question, and I'll be happy to answer you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
All right, everybody, we have reached our break time here, so we're going to take a quick 10 or so minute break, guess 10 and some change. So we're going to be meeting back for our next speaker here at 3:30 by my clock. So yeah, be back in just a couple minutes.